My name is John Wilson, and my family and I have been searching for the perfect place to escape the chaotic city life. We finally found it in a secluded ranch in rural Utah. It was far away from the hustle and bustle, and we couldn't have been more excited to start our new life. The ranch was nestled among rolling hills with a small creek meandering through the property. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sagebrush and wildflowers. I couldn't help but marvel at the stunning landscape that surrounded us. My wife, Sarah, and our two children, Emily and Noah, shared in my excitement as we explored our new home. As we settled into our daily routine, we began to notice peculiar occurrences around the property. One morning, while checking the fence line, I discovered strange animal tracks that seemed to come out of nowhere and lead to the edge of the woods. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the tracks seemed to change shape as they went along, as if the creature was shifting from one form to another. I tried to shake off the eerie feeling it gave me. Another night, Sarah and I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the night. We heard an odd, unnerving howl that seemed to echo from every direction. The children claimed they heard whispers outside their windows, but when we investigated, we found nothing amiss. One weekend, Sarah and I decided that we should make more of an effort to connect with our neighbors. We figured that getting to know them would not only help us feel more at home in our new community, but might also shed some light on the strange occurrences we've been experiencing. We planned a casual potluck dinner at our ranch and invited the closest families. We spent the day preparing the house, setting up tables and chairs outside, and cooking some of our favorite dishes. Sarah's homemade chili was always a hit, and I took pride in my barbecue skills. As our guests arrived, we greeted each of them warmly, eager to learn more about them and the area. The neighbors seemed genuinely pleased to be included, and they brought with them from homemade pies to wild game casseroles. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over our gathering, conversations flowed easily. We learned about the nearby families, their histories in the area, and the challenges and rewards of living in such a remote location. It wasn't until the fire pit was crackling and the stars began to make their appearance that the conversation turned to the ranch of the mysterious past. A sense of unease seemed to settle over the group as they began sharing hushed stories of unexplained events and eerie sightings. An older gentleman named Hank, who lived a few miles down the road, shared his own encounter with a strange, shape-shifting creature that had terrorized his livestock. Another neighbor, Susan, spoke of eerie whispers and shadowy figures that seemed to lurk in the surrounding woods. The more we listened to these stories, the more we realized that our own experiences were not unique. As the evening wore on, the tales of the ranch's history and the legend of the skinwalkers began to intertwine. It was clear that there was something more to the ranch than we initially understood. Our curiosity only grew stronger. Despite our skepticism, we couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that settled over us as the fire burned down to glowing embers. We thanked our guests for joining us and bid them good night. But as we lay in bed that night, Sarah and I couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to the stories that had been shared. As the days passed, our curiosity about the ranch and its history only grew stronger. Sarah and I spent hours researching the legend of the skinwalkers and the Native American tribes that once inhabited the area. Meanwhile, the strange occurrences on our property continued to escalate, becoming more terrifying and harder to ignore. One evening, Emily burst into the house, her eyes wide with fear. She claimed she'd seen a massive shadowy figure with glowing red eyes lurking near the edge of the woods while playing with Noah. Although we tried to reassure her that it was likely just her imagination, Sarah and I couldn't shake the feeling that our children were in danger. Determined to find answers, we reached out to a local historian, Dr. Elaine Morgan, and a Native American shaman named Gray Owl. Both were well versed in the area's history and legends, and we hoped they could shed some light on our situation. Dr. Morgan visited our ranch, her eyes widening as we showed her the Native American artifacts we'd discovered. She explained that the items were sacred to the ancient tribes that once lived on the land, and that they were believed to have a deep spiritual connection to the skinwalkers. According to Dr. Morgan, our ranch was built on land that was once considered sacred, a place where the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin. Gray Owl, a tall stoic man with a wealth of knowledge about his culture's beliefs and customs, confirmed Dr. Morgan's findings. He told us that the skinwalkers were powerful supernatural beings. hidden blow of shake-shifting and causing harm to those who trespassed on their territory. He believed that the curse on our ranch was real and that our family was in danger. Sura and I were stunned by these revelations, unsure of how to protect our children and ourselves from these malevolent creatures. Grey Owl offered to help us, explaining that there was a ritual that could be performed to appease the spirits and lift the curse from our land. However, he warned that the ritual would be dangerous and that we would need to confront the skinwalkers directly. With trepidation, we agreed to perform the ritual. We had no choice. The safety of our family was at stake. Grey Owl and Dr. Morgan guided us through the process, teaching us the ancient chants and gathering the necessary items to create a protective circle around their home. As the day of the ritual approached, the air seemed to grow heavier, and the atmosphere around the ranch became more oppressive. We knew that we were about to face a battle unlike anything we'd ever experienced, and we steeled ourselves for what was to come. The day of the ritual finally arrived, and the air was heavy with tension and anticipation. Sarah and I gathered our children close, reassuring them that everything would be okay. We could see the fear in their eyes, but we tried our best to put on brave faces. Grey Owl and Dr. Morgan arrived at our ranch as the sun began to dip below the horizon. They carried bundles of sage and sweetgrass, along with an assortment of other ritual items. Together, we prepared the space where we would perform the ceremony, creating a protective circle with sacred stones and symbols. As night fell and the first stars appeared, we began the ritual. Grey Owl led us in chanting ancient incantations, his deep voice echoing through the still air. The scent of burning sage and sweetgrass filled the air, creating a calming atmosphere that belied the tension we all felt. As the ritual progressed, we became acutely aware of the unseen forces that surrounded us. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the distant howls of creatures we couldn't see. Our hearts pounded in our chests, and we gripped each other's hands tightly, drawing strength from one another. Suddenly the skinwalkers appeared, their forms shifting and twisting before our very eyes. They were horrifying to behold, with grotesque features and an overwhelming sense of malevolence. Fear coursed through our veins, but we knew we couldn't back down now. Grey Owl shouted instructions to us, guiding us through the ritual as we faced the skinwalkers head-on. We held our ground, chanting the incantations with all the strength and conviction we could muster. The skinwalkers snarled and lunged at us, but the protective circle held them at bay, the sacred symbols glowing with a fierce ethereal light. The battle raged on, and we fought with everything we had. The skinwalkers grew more desperate, their forms twisting and contorting in a horrifying display of supernatural power. But we remained steadfast, determined to protect our family and our home. Finally, as the ritual reached its peak, the curse began to lift. The skinwalkers let out an agonized howl, their forms disintegrating before our very eyes. They retreated into the darkness, leaving behind a palpable sense of relief that washed over us. The crisp morning air filled my lungs as I set out on my hiking trip, eager to escape the stress of daily life. The sun had barely risen above the horizon, casting long shadows on the ground as I walked along the well-trodden trail. I marveled at the sight of dew-covered leaves glistening under the soft rays of sunlight, and the serene melody of birdsong welcomed me deeper into the woods. After a couple of hours, I came across a hidden, overgrown path that seemed to veer off the main trail. It appeared to have been long forgotten, with overhanging branches and thorny vines obstructing its entrance. Curiosity piqued. I decided to follow this mysterious path, feeling the thrill of discovery rush through my veins. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the foliage grew denser and the shadows seemed to close in around me. The sense of isolation intensified with each step, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the untouched beauty of this hidden trail. Eventually, I stumbled upon a long-lost campsite, now little more than a clearing surrounded by a thick underbrush. It was clear that it hadn't been used in years, possibly even decades. In the center of the clearing lay an abandoned backpack, its fabric faded and mourned by time. Intrigued, I cautiously approached it, my heart pounding in my chest. I knelt down and carefully opened the backpack, revealing its contents: a rusted canteen, a moldy sleeping bag, and a weathered journal, its pages yellowed and tattered. The journal seemed to be the most interesting item, so I picked it up and flipped to the first page, discovering that it belonged to a man named Thomas. As I began to read it, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The journal detailed Thomas's solo hiking trip, much like my own, and his discovery of his very campsite. It seemed that he too had been lured off the main trail by the enigmatic path that led to this clearing. I continued to read, feeling a growing sense of trepidation. The further I delved into Thomas's journal, the more I began to realize that his story was far from ordinary. There was something strange, something terrible hidden in these woods, and it seemed that Thomas had been unfortunate enough to discover it. My hands trembled slightly as I continued to read Thomas's journal, turning to the first entry dated June 4th, 1963. His handwriting was neat and precise, despite the age of the journal. I took a deep breath and began to read, hoping to uncover more about Thomas and his ominous discovery. Thomas wrote of his excitement and anticipation for his solo hiking trip, much like my own journey. He described the feeling of freedom and solitude that enveloped him as he ventured deeper into the woods. The words on the page painted a vivid picture of his surroundings: towering trees reaching for the sky, the earthy smell of damp soil, and the gentle rustle of leaves as a soft breeze swept through the forest. As I read on, I discovered that Thomas, too, had stumbled upon the hidden, overgrown trail that led him to the beautiful, seemingly untouched clearing where I now sat. He described the clearing in detail, mentioning the way sunlight dappled through the leaves, casting a warm glow on the forest floor. The serene beauty of the place had captivated him, and he decided to set up camp for the night. However, as darkness fell, Thomas's account took a more sinister turn. He wrote of strange noises outside his tent that sounded like whispers, barely audible but unmistakable in the stillness of the night. He recounted the sensation of goosebumps rising on his skin, and of hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, his heart palming in his chest as he strained to make out the source of the eerie whispers. Despite his unease, Thomas decided to stay in his tent, telling himself that the sounds were merely the wind playing tricks on his mind. He tried to focus on the soothing rhythm of the crickets and the gentle rustle of leaves. But the unsettling whispers seemed to grow louder, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. Thomas wrote of the overwhelming feeling that he was being watched, that there was something out there in the darkness, just beyond the thin walls of his tent. He struggled to fall asleep, his mind racing with thoughts on the unknown lurking in the shadows. As I finished reading the entry, my heart raced and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was sharing Thomas's experience. I glanced around the clearing nervously, acutely aware of the darkness that was beginning to settle around me. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers brushing the edge of the next page. I steeled myself and continued reading, compelled by Thomas's story and the chilling events that had unfolded in the very clearing where I now sat. The entry began with Thomas recounting his confusion upon waking up the following morning. The once beautiful clearing had transformed overnight, now overgrown and eerie, as if nature itself was conspiring against him. He described the gnarled branches that twisted menacingly above him and the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to weigh heavily on his chest. Determined to escape the unsettling clearing, Thomas tried to retrace his steps and fight his way back to the main trail. However, he soon realized that his map and compass were no longer reliable, as if the very landscape had shifted around him. He wrote of his growing disorientation and the creeping sense of dread that accompanied each step he took, further away from the safety of the familiar trail. As Thomas wandered through the disorienting woods, he stumbled upon a cave hidden by tangled vines and overgrown foliage. The mouth of the cave was adorned with strange ancient symbols that seemed to draw him in, despite the foreboding darkness that lay within. Unable to resist the inexplicable pull, Thomas ventured inside. The air inside the cave was damp and cool, the echo of each footstep, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that filled the space. Covered in luminescent moss and more of the mysterious symbols that seemed to dance in the dim light. As he ventured deeper into the cave, he began to hear the whispers again, the same eerie sounds that had haunted him the previous night. His heart palming in his chest, Thomas rounded a corner and came face to face with a terrifying otherworldly creature. The thing was a grotesque amalgamation of shadows and malice, its very presence an affront to the natural world. It was the source of the whispers that voiced a sinister chorus that seemed to reverberate inside his skull. As I read Thomas's account of the encounter, I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The terror he experienced was palpable on the page, and I couldn't help but glance around the clearing nervously, suddenly aware of every rustle and creak in the surrounding woods. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves as I turned to the final entry in Thomas's. The pages seemed to whisper softly as they turned, echoing the sinister chorus that haunted Thomas's story. The entry began with Thomas recounting his narrow escape from the cave, fueled by adrenaline and sheer terror. He described the heart-stopping race through the dark, winding passages, the whispers of the creature growing louder and more insistent with every step. The final burst of speed, Thomas managed to break free of the cave's suffocating embrace, stumbling into the sunlight. Now convinced that the creature had cursed him, Thomas wrote of his growing despair as he continued to wander the woods, unable to find his way back to civilization. He believed that the creature's malevolent influence had infected him, causing his disorientation and the unsettling transformation of his surroundings. With each step, Thomas felt as if he was being led further away from salvation, deeper into the inescapable clutches of the creature's domain. Thomas made the fateful decision to confront the creature once more, convinced that it was the only way to free himself from its crest. He described his resolve, his determination to face the horrifying entity that had haunted him since he first set foot in the now Almas clearing. The journal entry ended abruptly, the last few words trailing off into nothingness, leaving Thomas's fate uncertain. I stared at the final page, the weight of Thomas's story settling heavily on my chest. The terrible secret he had uncovered in these woods now felt like an oppressive shadow, a sinister presence that refused to be ignored. Feeling the urgent need to leave, I hastily packed up my belongings and set off, desperate to escape the woods and a terrifying secret hidden within. My heart pounded in my chest as I retraced my steps, the once peaceful forest now filled with menacing shadows and whispered threats. After what felt like an eternity, I finally emerged from the woods, the relief of returning to civilization washing over me. Unable to shake the haunting tale of Thomas and the terrible secret he had discovered, I researched his story and found that he was never found. His disappearance shrouded in mystery. Story 3. The weight of my past clung to me like an invisible shroud as I pulled up to the old secluded house. My heart was a tangled knot of nerves and anticipation, but I knew this fresh start was exactly what I needed. The divorce had taken its toll, and it was time for me to rediscover who I was. The house stood before me, a testament to the passage of time, its time-worn facade belying the hidden beauty within. As I walked through the creaky front door, a sense of unease washed over me. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to the lingering remnants of my past. I spent the first few days unpacking and organizing, trying to make the house feel like home. That's when I first noticed it. A shadow in the core of the living room that didn't seem to be cast by any visible source. I examined it from every angle, attempting to find a logical explanation, but it remained an enigma. At first, I dismissed the shadow as a trick of the light, or a figment of my overactive imagination. But as the days went by, the feeling of unease intensified. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was watching me, a silent witness to my every move. Sleep became elusive, my dreams invaded by whispers of darkness and the ever-present shadow. In the harsh light of day, I tried to ignore it, but it seemed to be growing bolder as if it were slowly creeping closer. Finally, my curiosity got the better of me. I needed to know what the shadow was and why it haunted the corners of my new home. I decided to delve into the history of the house, hoping to find some answers to the mystery that had begun to consume my thoughts. I had no idea that my search for the truth would uncover secrets far darker than I could have ever imagined. It was at the local library that I stumbled upon the name Edward, a reclusive artist who had once owned the house. His life was shrouded in mystery, and his disappearance had left the town abuzz with whispered speculation. As I dug deeper into Edward's past, I couldn't help but feel it the key to unraveling the enigma of the shadow in the corner lay hidden within the pages of his story. My investigation into Edward's life became an all-consuming obsession. I spent hours poring over newspaper clippings, old photographs, and any other pieces of information I could find. It was during one of my late-night research sessions that I stumbled upon a series of unsettling paintings Edward had left behind. Each painting depicted a haunting scene, But what struck me the most was the presence of a shadowy figure lurking in the background. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that the figure bore an uncanny resemblance to the shadow in my living room. It was then that I knew I needed help. My search led me to John, a local historian who had researched Edward's life and art extensively. Together we examined the paintings, trying to decipher the message hidden within the brushstrokes. Our conversations were filled with theories and conjecture, but we both knew that we were dancing around the undeniable truth. The shadow in the corner was more than just a trick of the light. As John and I delved deeper into Edward's past, we discovered a dark secret. The artist had been involved in the occult, making a pact with a malevolent entity in exchange for artistic inspiration. The thought sent a chill down my spine, and I couldn't help but wonder if that very same entity was now haunting my home. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, John and I decided to visit the places that had been significant in Edward's life. We started with his studio, a small dusty room filled with half-finished paintings and the lingering scent of turpentine. The air felt heavy as if the room itself held the weight of Edward's secret. As we continued our investigation, it became clear that the shadowy figure was more than just a figment of Edward's imagination. Each location we visited seemed to hold a piece of the puzzle, and we were slowly but surely uncovering the truth behind the malevolent force that had once held Edward in its thrall. With each new piece of information, the shadow in the corner of my living room seemed to grow more restless, as if it sensed that its secret was on the verge of being revealed. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I knew that I couldn't let this malevolent presence continue to control my life. It was time to confront the shadow in the corner and put an end to its reign of terror once and for all. But first, John and I needed to uncover the truth about Edward's pact and find a way to break the hold that the entity had around. As John and I continued to piece together the fragments of Edward's story, we came to understand the gravity of the situation. The malevolent entity that had once haunted Edward was now trying to latch onto me, seeking a new host to further its sinister agenda. Desperate for a solution, we enlisted the help of Marian, a psychic renowned for her abilities to sense and combat malevolent energies. Upon entering my home, she was immediately aware of the oppressive presence that lurked in the shadows. Marian confirmed our suspicions, explaining that the entity was attempting to strengthen its connection to me by drawing on my fears and vulnerabilities. It was then that I knew I needed to face my own demons in order to sever the link that tethered the entity to my life. With Marianne's guidance, John and I visited each location tied to the shadowy figure confronting the malevolent force that resided within. At each site, we were met with resistance, a palpable pushback from the darkness that sought to maintain its grip on the trapped souls connected to the entity. As we delved deeper into the mystery, we discovered that the trapped souls were all connected to a series of unsolved cold cases. These spirits, unable to find peace in the afterlife, had become entangled in the entities, their suffering fueling its insatiable hunger for power. It became clear that in order to banish the entity and free the trapped souls, we would need to solve the cold cases and bring justice to those who had been wronged. With renewed determination, we threw ourselves into the task, meticulously gathering evidence and following leads that had long been forgotten. As we worked, I felt the shadow in the core growing more agitated, its desperation manifesting in a series of terrifying encounters that tested my resolve. But with each confrontation, I grew stronger, the bonds that had once tethered me to the darkness slowly starting to unravel. Our quest for justice was arduous, but with each cold case we solved, the trapped souls found peace and were released from the entity's grip. The malevolent force, sensing its power wanting, became increasingly desperate in its attempts to maintain its hold on my life. As we closed in on the final case, the entity's influence over the house reached a fever pitch. Objects flew across rooms, doors slammed shut, and the once persistent Chow seemed to grow larger, threatening to engulf the entire living room. But with Marianne's guidance, I stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated by the darkness that had invaded my home. Finally, we uncovered the truth behind the last cold case. A young woman wrongfully accused of a crime she did not commit. Her spirit, trapped in limbo and tormented by the injustice she had suffered, had been the perfect target for the malevolent entity. With the evidence we had gathered, John and Anna were able to clear her name, allowing her spirit to find the peace she so desperately deserved. As her soul was released, a palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere of my home. The oppressive darkness that had once threatened to suffocate me began to recede, pushed back by the light that now filled the space. The shadow in the corner, now weakened and diminished, was no longer able to maintain its hold on my life. I felt the last remnants of its power slip away, its presence in my home reduced to nothing more than a distant memory. With a malevolent entity banished and the trapped souls set free, my house was finally purged of the darkness that had once threatened to consume me. I could finally begin my new life, unburdened by the shadow in the corner and the weight of my past. Through our shared journey, John, Marion, and I had forged an unbreakable bond. We had faced the darkness together, and in the process had discovered a strength within ourselves that we never knew we possessed.